Go get coffee." "Excuse me," she said. "Are you deaf or just stupid coffee now?" "Sir, I was told to wait for the briefing." "The briefing is for billionaires, not black janitors who use their brains to mop floors." Julian Sterling didn't even look at her. He snapped his fingers at the door and said, "Move. You're stinking up my boardroom." Simone Davenport stood still. She wore a simple gray sweater, no jewelry, and held a notepad pressed against her hip. His massive entourage filed past her. One snickered. Another pulled out a phone and began recording. "Who let her in here?" Julian muttered. "She dared to crawl into my building. That stinking rat. Security! Drag her out!" Simone stood there with her arms crossed and said absolutely nothing. But what Julian Sterling didn't know, what nobody in that room could have guessed, was that this quiet woman could erase his entire empire with one single signature. The Sterling Dynamics Tower rose 42 stories above Midtown Manhattan, built entirely of steel and tinted glass, the kind of building deliberately designed to make people on the sidewalk feel small. The lobby smelled like fresh leather and immense wealth. A 12-foot oil portrait of Harrison Sterling, Julian's grandfather, hung behind the massive reception desk. The paint was so thick you could see the brush strokes from across the vast room. Today was supposed to be the biggest day in company history. A $1 billion drone contract with the Department of Defense was ready for the final signatures. The champagne was already chilling in Julian's corner office on the 42nd floor. His public relations team had drafted the press release early that morning. The headline read, "Sterling Dynamics secures largest defense contract in company history." Julian Sterling III had been waiting for this deal his entire life, not earning it, just waiting for it. His grandfather had built the company from a single aircraft parts factory. His father had turned it into a massive defense contractor with deep Pentagon connections and a contact list thicker than a phone book. Julian had inherited all of it. The lucrative contracts, the towering building, the powerful name. At 31 years old, when his father passed away from a sudden heart attack on a luxury golf course, Julian inherited the entire empire. He didn't, however, inherit the talent. He was responsible for 3 failed product lines, 2 Securities and Exchange Commission inquiries, and 1 quiet settlement with a former assistant who had accused him of things the lawyers made sure never reached a courtroom. But none of that mattered when your last name was Sterling and your company held 6 active Pentagon contracts. Julian arrived that morning wearing a pristine charcoal suit, expensive cufflinks shaped like tiny fighter jets, and a level of arrogance that had never once been tested by reality. His entourage followed closely behind. They included 2 high-priced lawyers, a vice president of communications named Vanessa Pierce, and a silent man in a navy blazer who existed only to carry Julian's expensive coffee. The boardroom on the 38th floor had been prepared like a grand stage. The heavy mahogany table was polished to a mirror finish. 14 luxurious leather chairs surrounded it. A large projection screen displayed the Sterling Dynamics logo rotating slowly, as if the brand itself demanded to be admired from every possible angle. Soon, the room was completely full. Wealthy board members, nervous investors, military liaisons in perfectly pressed uniforms, basically everyone who mattered. And then, there was Simone Davenport. She had arrived earlier that morning with no private driver and no entourage. She took the public subway from her modest apartment, walked 6 blocks in sensible flat shoes, and entered through the main lobby just like any ordinary visitor. The receptionist had taken one look at her simple gray sweater, her plain face, and her lack of a security badge, and immediately pointed toward the service elevator, saying, "The staff entrance is around the back, ma'am." Simone calmly replied, "I'm here for the defense briefing." The receptionist blinked, then smiled the specific way people smile when they think someone is deeply confused. She said, "The defense briefing is executive level only." "I know," Simone replied softly. She took the main elevator to the 38th floor, found a seat at the far end of the long boardroom table, sat down her simple notepad, and waited quietly. Nobody greeted her. Nobody offered her a glass of water. A man in a sharp pinstripe suit glanced at her once, then turned to his colleague and whispered, "Did they hire new cleaning staff?" She heard it. She always heard it. Simone Davenport had been hearing those kinds of whispers since she was 12 years old. Back then, she was standing in the gifted program classroom at a public middle school on the south side of Chicago, the only black girl in a room full of students who couldn't believe she had scored higher than all of them. Her mother, Cecilia, worked double shifts as a dedicated nurse at the local hospital. She raised Simone and her two brothers entirely alone. She never missed a school play, and she never let a single report card go unsigned. When Simone earned a full academic scholarship to Harvard Law, Cecilia cried for 20 straight minutes in their tiny kitchen and then immediately went to work the night shift because the Bills didn't care about celebrations. Harvard graduate, Pentagon internship, Department of Defense Senior Counsel, Deputy Assistant Secretary at age 34, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment at age 38. This quiet woman in the gray sweater personally controlled every single weapons contract over $1 billion. But in this opulent room, they only saw a woman who didn't belong. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood silently by the massive window, his hands clasped behind his back. He was Julian's senior military aide, technically speaking. In truth, he was the only person in the entire building who had read the dense briefing packet cover to cover. He was the only one who knew exactly who Simone Davenport was. He had tried to warn Julian twice. Julian had waved him off both times. Julian Sterling entered the boardroom the exact way a man enters a room he truly believes he owns, which technically he did. The heavy double doors swung open dramatically. His lawyers flanked him like hired bodyguards. Vanessa Pierce walked 2 steps behind him, her phone already raised, her thumb hovering right over the record button. The silent coffee carrier trailed at the very back, holding a porcelain cup that cost more than most people pay for rent. Julian quickly scanned the room. The board members nodded eagerly. The military liaisons straightened their ties. The projection screen glowed behind him like a digital halo. Then his eyes landed on Simone. She was still sitting quietly at the far end of the long table, her notepad open, her pen in hand, her gray sweater unchanged. Julian stopped walking. He stared at her and said, "You're still here." Simone looked up calmly and replied, "Yes, sir." "I thought I told you to get coffee," Julian said. "You did," she answered. "And," he pressed. "I'm not here for coffee," she said simply. A sudden ripple of discomfort moved through the room. One board member shifted awkwardly in his chair. Another studied his shiny cufflinks with sudden, intense focus. Julian tilted his head, exactly the way a dog tilts its head before it decides whether to bark or to bite. "Who let her in here?" he demanded, turning to the room. "Seriously, who authorized this?" Nobody answered him. 14 powerful people in the room, and not a single voice spoke up. "Probably lost," someone muttered from the far side of the table. Light laughter followed, the cowardly kind of laughter that comes from relief. Relief that the cruel joke wasn't aimed at them. Julian walked closer. His expensive shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. Each step was deliberate. Each step was louder than the last. He planted both of his hands firmly on the table and leaned aggressively toward Simone. He was close enough that she could smell his heavy cologne. It was something incredibly expensive and overpowering, the absolute olfactory equivalent of a raised voice. "My father ran this building," Julian sneered. "My grandfather built it. 3 generations of Sterlings have sat in this very chair." He tapped the thick leather headrest of the seat at the head of the table. "You don't belong in this room, sweetheart." The word landed like a lit match dropped on pure gasoline, but Simone's expression didn't change at all. There wasn't a single flinch, not even a blink. "I was invited to this briefing, sir," she said evenly. "Invited?" Julian laughed a loud, mocking laugh. He looked around the room for validation, and he got it. Tight smiles, nervous chuckles, eyes that looked absolutely everywhere except at Simone. "By who?" Julian asked. "The overnight cleaning company." More laughter erupted, louder this time. Permission to be cruel had been officially granted. Julian snapped his fingers at the large security guard standing by the door, a broad, intimidating man named Braddock, an ex-military enforcer, the kind of man who strictly followed orders because thinking about them was way above his pay grade. "Braddock, get her out," Julian commanded. Braddock moved forward heavily. He took 3 big steps and then he suddenly stopped. He looked directly at Simone. She looked calmly back at him. Her gaze was steady and unwavering. It was the specific way someone looks at you when they know a deeply important secret that you should probably know too. Braddock hesitated. "Now, Braddock," Julian snapped. "Sir, she says she was invited," Braddock mumbled uncomfortably. "I don't care if the president himself invited her," Julian yelled. "This is my building, my boardroom, and my rules. Get her out of here right now." Braddock slowly reached for Simone's arm. His heavy hand hovered just 1 inch from her elbow. She didn't move. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. "It's all right," she said to Braddock. Her voice was quiet, almost kind. "I'll move." She stood up gracefully, picked up her notepad, walked all the way to the opposite end of the long table, further from Julian and closer to the exit doors, and sat down again. She didn't leave. Julian's jaw tightened in fury. A prominent vein appeared on the side of his neck, pulsing with the specific kind of dangerous anger that comes from a spoiled man who isn't being blindly obeyed. "Did you just—" Julian started. "I moved, sir, exactly as you asked," Simone replied softly. The entire room held its collective breath. Vanessa Pierce leaned against the wall near the window, keeping her phone perfectly steady, the red recording dot blinking continuously. She had cleverly switched from a simple recording to a live stream a few minutes ago. The viewer count was quickly climbing, 42, 89, 116. She typed a quick, sensational caption across the bottom of the screen. It read, "Arrogant black woman refuses to leave billionaire boardroom. This is pure gold." She added 3 laughing face emojis and a fire emoji and hit send. The comments flooded in instantly, laughing out loud. "Just drag her out already. Who on earth does she think she is? Security is completely sleeping on the job for real." Vanessa smiled proudly. Content was content after all. Colonel Marcus Thorne, still standing stiffly by the window with his arms behind his back, softly cleared his throat. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Julian's elbow. It was a deliberate, gentle touch, the desperate touch of a wise man trying to steer a doomed ship away from the jagged rocks. "Sir, perhaps you should just," the colonel whispered. Julian violently yanked his arm away. "I absolutely don't need any unsolicited advice from my dead father's tired leftovers," he hissed. Those cruel words hit the colonel like a physical backhand across the face. 23 long years of loyal service to Sterling Dynamics, 3 brutal wars, 2 Purple Hearts. And right here, in front of 14 important people and a growing live stream, he was viciously reduced to a leftover. The colonel stepped back slowly. His rugged face didn't change, but his eyes definitely did. Something fundamental had shifted deeply behind them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was something much closer to total resignation. It was the haunting look of a man who had desperately tried to stop a speeding car from driving off a cliff and was now simply stepping back to watch it fall. Julian turned back to address the silent room. "You know what? Fine. Just let her sit there. Let her watch. Maybe she'll actually learn something about how real business works today." He arrogantly unbuttoned his custom jacket and dropped heavily into the huge leather head chair. He pointed a finger at Simone and said, "But if you touch absolutely anything, if you speak a single word, if you so much as breathe too loud in my presence, I'll have you physically removed, and I'll make sure you never set foot in any building with my family name on it ever again. Do you understand me?" Simone said absolutely nothing. She just calmly opened her plain notepad to a fresh, blank page. Julian finally launched into his massive presentation. He proudly discussed the new drone contract, the billion-dollar figures, the colorful slide showing projected revenue, the advanced military applications, and the estimated job creation across 3 different states. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had never once been told no, or more accurately, a man who had simply never listened when someone bravely tried. 15 minutes into the presentation, he noticed Simone quietly writing. He stopped speaking in the middle of his sentence. "What exactly are you doing?" he demanded. "Taking notes, sir," she replied calmly. "Notes?" he scoffed. He stormed around the large table, storming past the wealthy board members who fearfully pressed themselves into their expensive chairs like terrified schoolchildren, avoiding a cruel teacher's angry gaze. "Give me that!" He viciously snatched the notepad right out of her hands. The sudden motion was quick and incredibly aggressive enough to make even Vanessa Pierce flinch behind her phone camera, which was really saying something. Julian looked down at the page. He saw neat handwriting, organized bullet points, and complex words he didn't even bother reading, because actually reading them would have required the kind of basic humility he had never been taught. He violently tore the entire first page out. The loud sound of ripping paper cut through the silent room like a sudden scream in a quiet cathedral. He crumpled it up tightly and dropped it onto the table right in front of her face. "Notes," he mocked loudly, "in my boardroom. With my pen." He turned to the crowded room and spread his arms wide in theatrical disbelief. "Can you people believe this? The janitor is taking notes. Total silence followed. Then Warren Pendleton, a 62-year-old man with perfectly styled silver hair and a golf handicap of 6. The exact kind of spineless man who had survived 40 long years in corporate America by never once saying what he actually thought, produced a polite, sycophantic chuckle. That was all it took. The rest of the room eagerly followed his lead. The laughter rolled across the polished mahogany table like a dark wave, each person desperately adding to it because stopping meant standing entirely alone against Julian's wrath. Vanessa Pierce quickly zoomed in on the crumpled page, then on Simone's face, and finally on Julian's triumphant grin. The live stream had just crossed 400 active viewers. Her phone buzzed frantically with notifications she didn't even bother reading. This was easily the best viral content she had produced in months. Julian strutted back to the head of the table like a conquering king. He casually loosened his expensive tie. The room felt much smaller now. The air felt incredibly thick, pressing tight against the large windows like a heavy fog. "Meeting resumes," he announced proudly, "and someone please get this woman a dirty mop, since she clearly likes working with her hands so much." Cruel laughter erupted again. Real, full laughter this time. The absolute worst kind that fills up a room, but completely empties a soul. Simone sat perfectly still. Her notepad was gone. Her pen lay on the table, completely untouched. Her hands were calmly folded in her lap. But something important had just changed. For the absolute first time since she walked into the building that morning, Simone Davenport's expression shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't tears. It certainly wasn't the fearful flinch that Julian was desperately looking for. It was a smile. It was a small, incredibly quiet smile. The rare kind of smile that purposely doesn't reach the eyes, because it simply doesn't need to. It was the devastating kind of smile that clearly says, "I know something that you don't." Colonel Thorne saw that subtle smile from all the way across the room. And, for the very first time that entire morning, Colonel Marcus Thorne felt something cold that he hadn't felt in many years. Pure fear. Julian's presentation resumed exactly like nothing had happened. He stood proudly at the head of the table, a high-tech laser pointer in his hand, clicking through his colorful slides with the smooth rhythm of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment in front of his bathroom mirror for weeks. He showed revenue projections, deployment timelines, and a flashy animated graphic showing Sterling drones dramatically sweeping across a vast desert landscape. The company logo was proudly stamped in the corner like a watermark on stolen art. "This contract," Julian said loudly, pausing for dramatic effect, "isn't just a business deal. It's a legacy. My grandfather shook hands with famous generals. My father dined with legendary secretaries of defense. And now I'm going to single-handedly deliver the most advanced autonomous drone fleet this great country has ever seen." He confidently clicked to the very next slide. It showed a glossy photograph of himself shaking hands with a prominent senator at a lavish fundraiser. The senator was smiling politely. Julian was smiling much harder. "Phase 1, he announced. 1,200 units deployed rapidly across 3 active theaters. Phase 2, full integration with existing surveillance infrastructure. Phase 3, he tapped the screen firmly. Total global market dominance." The board members nodded aggressively. They had seen these exact slides before. They would nod at absolutely anything Julian showed them because their lucrative stock options heavily depended on it. Simone sat quietly at the far end of the table with no notepad, no pen, and absolutely nothing in her hands except the quiet, devastating certainty of a woman who had personally read every single classified page of the proposal that Julian was currently butchering with empty corporate buzzwords. She listened. She listened to him confidently misquote the unit cost by 14%. She listened to him proudly cite a readiness rating that had been officially downgraded 6 weeks ago. She listened to him arrogantly promise delivery timelines that explicitly violated 3 separate federal procurement regulations. And she quietly remembered every single word. Julian paused the presentation abruptly to take an incoming phone call. He didn't leave the room to take it. He took it right there at the head of the table, speaking loud enough for everyone to clearly hear, because basic privacy was a concept for people who had something to hide, and Julian Sterling hid absolutely nothing, except for the terrible things his expensive lawyers hid for him. "Tell the senator that I'll gladly call him right after the signing," Julian barked into the phone, and politely remind him exactly who paid for his last election campaign. He hung up abruptly and smiled widely at the room. "Politics," he said smoothly, as if the word itself were a clever punchline. During the loud call, Simone had subtly shifted in her chair. She had uncrossed her arms and gently placed both of her palms flat on the table. It was a very small gesture, almost entirely invisible to most, but Colonel Thorne noticed it from the window and recognized it immediately. It was the exact posture she always used in highly classified Senate hearings. The unyielding posture that directly preceded the difficult questions nobody ever wanted to answer. 20 minutes into the presentation, Julian made a joke, the specific kind of joke that only works when nobody in the room is legally allowed to not laugh. "You know what the absolute best part about this massive contract is?" he asked, loosening his tie another arrogant inch. "Once we officially sign it today, even the poor janitor sitting in the back row gets to tell her friends she was in the room when history was made." He looked directly, menacingly at Simone. The room immediately laughed, not because the joke was remotely funny, but because Julian was intensely looking around at them to make sure they did. Warren Pendleton laughed the absolute longest. He had perfected the pathetic art of laughing at powerful men's terrible jokes. The timing, the volume, the exact way he placed his hand on the table as if steadying himself from the overwhelming hilarity of it all. It was a required corporate survival skill. It had kept him comfortably employed for 4 decades. Eleanor Vance, the chief financial officer, didn't laugh at all. She nervously pressed her lips tightly together and stared blankly at a high point on the far wall where the paint met the ceiling. She had a bright young daughter who was exactly Simone's age. She thought deeply about that daughter right now, and she felt something truly sour and shameful rise in her throat. Vanessa Pierce slowly panned her phone across the large room, capturing the sycophantic laughter and then capturing Simone's face. Simone was still entirely unmoved, like a solid rock in a rushing river of noise. The live stream had just crossed 900 active viewers. The comments were scrolling so fast she could barely read them. Why is she still sitting there? This man is an absolute savage, laughing out loud. "Somebody please get this woman a broom for real." Vanessa frantically typed, "She's still sitting here. She hasn't left. I'm literally dead." Fire emoji, skull emoji, send. Julian confidently continued. He talked about wide profit margins and complex subcontractor networks in something he proudly called strategic battlefield synergy, which meant absolutely nothing, but sounded like it did. He talked endlessly for another 10 minutes without saying a single factual thing that Simone hadn't already flagged as fraudulent in her strict compliance review 3 weeks earlier. Then, Julian suddenly noticed her hands. Simone was sitting with her arms crossed again, her eyes facing forward, her fingers tapping her left elbow in a slow, incredibly steady rhythm. 1 tap exactly per second, like a metronome, like a ticking countdown. Julian stared at her angrily for a long moment. "You're still writing things down in your head, aren't you?" Simone didn't answer him. "I asked you a direct question," Julian snapped. "I'm simply listening, sir," she replied quietly. "That's all," Julian sneered. "Just listening." Julian walked slowly toward her. The laser pointer was still tightly gripped in his hand, the red dot trailing across the polished table like a dangerous sniper's sight. "Let me tell you a little something about listening, sweetheart. Listening is what poor people do when they simply can't afford to talk. Listening is exactly what the help does. Listening is what you should have been doing when I clearly told you to go get my coffee 30 minutes ago." He stopped exactly 2 feet from her chair. "You really want to know what I think?" He leaned down aggressively. His hot breath brushed her forehead. "I think you wandered in here right off the street. I think you saw a very fancy building and thought you'd sit in a very fancy chair and pretend you actually mattered for an hour. And I think when this meeting is finally over, you're going to walk out that door and go right back to whatever sad, pathetic little life you came from, and absolutely nobody in this room will ever remember your name." Simone looked slowly up at him, directly into his eyes. For the first time, she firmly held his aggressive gaze without looking away. "Are you quite finished, sir?" The question was incredibly quiet, just 5 simple words, but they landed heavily in the silent room like a live grenade with the pin still pulled out. Harmless for the exact moment, but incredibly dangerous if you truly understood what it meant. Julian blinked in surprise. For half a second, something completely foreign flickered across his face. It wasn't doubt. Julian Sterling never did doubt, but it was something closely adjacent to it. It was a primal warning that his body instantly recognized, even if his arrogant brain flatly refused to accept it. He recovered incredibly fast. "Am I finished?" He laughed loudly and turned to the stunned room. "She wants to know if I'm finished. Sweetheart, I haven't even started yet." He straightened up tall and swaggered back to the head of the table. He casually picked up a heavy crystal glass of water, took a long sip, and set it down with a deliberate, echoing clink. "If I ever lose this massive contract," he said loudly to no one in particular, gesturing broadly at the ceiling as if the building itself were listening to him, "I'll personally buy the Pentagon and fire everyone inside it, starting immediately with the help." The room went dead quiet, not the comfortable, warm quiet of agreement. The brittle, terrifying quiet of cowardly people who fully recognized that an invisible line had just been crossed, but who entirely lacked the courage to actually say so. "Now, where were we?" Julian asked smugly. Yes, phase 3. He clicked confidently to the next slide, but right before he could speak another word, his phone suddenly buzzed. Then his lead lawyer's phone buzzed. Then Vanessa Pierce's phone buzzed. 3 phones, 3 loud vibrations, 3 sets of panicked eyes instantly dropping to glowing screens at the exact same time. Julian completely ignored his phone. He was right in the middle of his grand performance. But his lead attorney, Simon Roth, absolutely didn't ignore his. Simon read the urgent message once, and then he read it again. His face drastically changed the way a clear sky changes right before a violent storm, slowly at first, and then all at once. He stood up from his leather chair so abruptly that it loudly squeaked against the floor. "Julian," Simon whispered urgently. "Not right now, Simon," Julian snapped. "Julian, you really need to look at," the lawyer pleaded. "I said not right now," Julian yelled. Simon Roth slowly sat back down, but he didn't put his phone away. He held it trembling under the table, the bright screen facing straight up, the harsh glow reflecting off his glasses like a frantic warning light in a crashing airplane that nobody was watching. Colonel Thorne hadn't moved an inch from the window. He had watched the entire disastrous presentation with the eerie stillness of a man attending a solemn funeral, present, deeply respectful, and incredibly aware that something totally irreversible was about to happen. His phone hadn't buzzed because he didn't need a digital notification. He had known since early that morning when he received a highly classified briefing memo explicitly marked for his eyes only. The official memo was exactly 2 pages long. The bold subject line read, "Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Official On-Site Compliance Review, Sterling Dynamics Contract 9012. The primary reviewer's name was clearly listed on page 1, paragraph 3, Simone Davenport. The colonel had printed that memo, walked directly into Julian's office beforehand, and placed it right on the center of his desk. Julian had casually used it as a cardboard coaster for his morning espresso. Now, Colonel Thorne stood quietly by the window and watched Julian Sterling completely insult the exact woman who currently held his entire company's future in the palm of her hands. He watched the greedy board members laugh. He watched Vanessa Pierce broadcast the disaster to thousands of complete strangers. He watched Simon Roth's face completely drain of all color as the terrifying implications settled in like heavy sediment at the bottom of a dark glass. And the colonel simply did what he had always done in difficult moments like these. He waited, because the heavy boardroom door was about to open, and whatever walked through it would permanently change absolutely everything Julian Sterling thought he knew about real power. The door opened. It wasn't fast and it wasn't slow. It was the specific kind of open that comes with immense weight behind it. The heavy weight of rank, strict protocol, and the United States Department of Defense. 2 heavily armed military police officers entered the room first. Their dress uniforms were pressed sharp enough to cut glass. They immediately took strict positions on either side of the wide doorframe and stood at perfect rigid attention. Their eyes locked forward, their backs completely straight, as if the building's walls themselves had suddenly snapped to a rigid salute. Then he walked in. 4 shiny stars on each strong shoulder, silver hair cropped incredibly close, and a square jaw that looked exactly like it had been carved from the same hard stone they used for national war memorials. General Clayton Monroe, United States Army. 31 years of dedicated service, 2 brutal combat tours, and the exact kind of quiet, terrifying authority that instantly made crowded rooms fall completely silent before he ever said a single word. The boardroom immediately fell dead silent. Julian looked up in total shock from his colorful slides. His mouth was still hanging open from the arrogant sentence he had been halfway through. Something about phase 3. Something about global market dominance. Something that suddenly no longer mattered at all. "General," Julian stammered loudly. He quickly tried to recover. He always did. He hastily buttoned his suit jacket, frantically straightened his posture, and aggressively extended his hand across the wide table. Welcome to Sterling Dynamics. We were just quickly wrapping up the General Monroe absolutely didn't take his hand. He didn't even look at Julian. He walked straight past the terrified board members. He walked past Warren Pendleton, who desperately pressed himself into his chair as if trying to magically disappear into the fine leather. He walked past Eleanor Vance, whose wide eyes followed the towering general with the intense focus of a smart woman who had just realized the room's entire geometry was about to shift. He walked past Vanessa Pierce, whose trembling phone was still recording, still actively live streaming, still capturing absolutely everything that was about to happen to an eager audience that had now officially crossed 1,500 active viewers. General Monroe walked to the far end of the long table, stopping right in front of the quiet woman in the simple gray sweater. He stopped perfectly, squared his broad shoulders, and gave a sharp, flawless salute. "Madam Secretary," the general said loudly, "we are fully ready when you are." Those unbelievable words landed like a massive detonation in a tightly sealed room. Julian's hand was still awkwardly extended. It hung suspended in the dead air like a foolish question that nobody was ever going to answer. His arrogant smile completely collapsed in rapid stages. First, the corners of his mouth fell, then his jaw went slack, and finally something deep behind his eyes shattered, a false confidence that had never truly been challenged before. "Secretary of exactly what?" Julian whispered in horror. Simone Davenport stood up. Very slowly, she calmly reached beneath the modest collar of her gray sweater and pulled out a hidden lanyard. It had a heavy silver chain, a massive Department of Defense official seal, and a photo identification card with a thick blue stripe that meant clearance levels Julian Sterling had never even heard of. She unclipped it gracefully and set it firmly on the mahogany table. "Assistant Secretary of Defense," she said clearly, "acquisition and sustainment." The entire room didn't just gasp. It was so much worse than a simple gasp. It was the collective, terrifying sound of 14 wealthy people totally understanding at the exact same moment that every cruel laugh, every terrible joke, every arrogant snicker, and every single mocking emoji Vanessa Pierce had typed. All of it had been perfectly recorded. All of it had been officially witnessed. All of it had been viciously done to the exact woman who personally controlled every single weapons contract over $1 billion. Julian's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again, helplessly. "That's not possible," he choked out. Simone calmly picked up the heavy lanyard and clipped it securely back around her neck. "I absolutely assure you it is." Simon Roth, Julian's lead attorney, was already springing to his feet. He frantically crossed the massive room in 4 huge steps and whispered directly into Julian's ear. The panicked whisper lasted exactly 6 seconds. Whatever terrible thing he said completely drained all the remaining color from Julian's pale face, the exact way an open plug instantly drains a full bathtub. Fast, complete, and totally irreversible. Julian gripped the hard edge of the table. His knuckles went completely white. The shiny fighter jet cufflinks caught the bright overhead light and threw tiny, pathetic reflections across the ceiling, glinting like desperate distress signals. Simone opened the plain folder she had carried in that morning, the exact same one that had been sitting quietly on the table the entire time, completely untouched, remarkably unremarkable, practically invisible in its plainness. "Your massive contract, sir," she said coldly. She smoothly slid a thick document across the polished mahogany surface. "The exact one your father always promised you." Julian stared down at the crisp page. His lips moved slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. "You can't do this," he finally whispered. "I certainly can," she replied smoothly. 3 simple words delivered the exact way a skilled surgeon delivers a terminal diagnosis. Absolutely no emotion, 0 hesitation, just cold fact. "I personally review every single billion-dollar award that crosses the Pentagon's desk," Simone stated. "Every flashy proposal, every hidden subcontractor filing, every single compliance checkpoint." She calmly folded her hands on the table, the exact same hands he had viciously dismissed, the exact same hands he had completely ignored. "Yours just massively failed compliance," she declared. That devastating sentence hit the room like a sudden, total power outage. Warren Pendleton completely stopped breathing. Eleanor Vance tightly closed her eyes in pure defeat. Vanessa Pierce's hand trembled violently, but she absolutely didn't stop recording. She couldn't. This was no longer just viral content. This was federal evidence. Julian looked desperately at General Monroe. The massive general stood stoically behind Simone's chair, with his strong hands clasped behind his back, his stern expression as unreadable as a solid granite wall. Julian looked frantically at Colonel Thorne. The colonel stood quietly by the window, exactly where he had been for the past hour. His arms were folded, his face neutral, but his eyes loudly said what his mouth never would. "I tried to tell you." Julian finally looked at his lawyer. Simon Roth just shook his head once, a very small, desperate motion, the universal attorney gesture for "please stop talking immediately." Julian looked fearfully back at Simone. She hadn't raised her voice at all. She hadn't dramatically stood on the table. She hadn't pointed an angry finger or violently thrown a document or done any of the loud, aggressive things Julian would have definitely done if the roles were suddenly reversed. She had simply told the absolute truth, and the cold truth had walked right into the room wearing a gray sweater. Simone reached calmly into her folder and pulled out a single pen. It was heavy, black, matte, and totally unremarkable, except for the shining federal seal pressed deeply into the top cap. The official seal of the United States Department of Defense. The specific kind of pen that absolutely didn't write friendly letters. It wrote permanent endings. She carefully set it on the table right next to the rejected document. "One single signature instantly terminates your contract," she said softly. Julian's leather chair creaked loudly as he leaned back in terror. His mouth was bone dry. His tongue felt incredibly thick and utterly useless, exactly like a piece of old leather left out in the blazing sun. "One quick call permanently reopens the public bid," she continued. She smoothly pulled out her phone and placed it right beside the heavy pen. The screen was dark, just waiting. "One brief sentence ends your high-level security clearance forever." 3 devastating statements, 3 powerful weapons. All of them sitting quietly on a polished mahogany table directly between a brilliant woman in a gray sweater and a spoiled man whose entire powerful world had just been violently reduced to the exact size of a single signature line. Julian's knees finally buckled. He didn't completely fall to the ground. He just totally folded inward. His weak body found the chair behind him the exact way a condemned building finds the ground during a controlled demolition. The expensive leather groaned loudly under his suddenly dead weight. "Please," his voice cracked pathetically on the word. "Let's just talk." Simone looked deeply at him, with the exact same eyes he had mocked, the exact same face he had arrogantly told to go get coffee, the exact same woman he had viciously called a janitor, a stinking rat. The help. "You absolutely had your chance to talk," she said coldly, "right when you decided to call me the help." Julian frantically gripped the armrest. "My family proudly built this floor," he begged. "Your family merely rented it," Simone replied smoothly. Her voice absolutely didn't rise. It simply didn't need to. The hard-working taxpayers proudly own it. Every single square foot, every large window, every leather chair you're sitting in right now was legally purchased with a massive federal facilities contract that I personally approved 18 months ago. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. All the fight had totally left his body, the exact way compressed air leaves a violently punctured tire. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Simone slowly picked up the heavy pen. She carefully uncapped it. The sharp click loudly echoed in the silent room, exactly like a gunshot in a deep canyon. She looked closely at the document, then at Julian, and then at the document again. The tip of the pen touched the paper. She signed. One perfectly fluid motion, zero hesitation, absolutely no dramatic pause, just permanent ink on paper, and an entire billion-dollar contract instantly turned to dust. Warren Pendleton quickly pushed his chair far back from the table. The wheels squeaked loudly against the marble. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. He just desperately created physical distance, acting as if bankruptcy were highly contagious. Eleanor Vance stood up, quietly collected her heavy binder, and walked straight toward the exit door without making eye contact with absolutely anyone. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor in a steady rhythm that sounded exactly like a total retreat. Vanessa Pierce's thumb still hovered anxiously over her phone. The live stream was amazingly still running. 1,800 active viewers now. The comments had drastically shifted. There were absolutely no more laughing emojis, no more skull emojis. Now it was all, Oh my God, she's the actual secretary. He's completely done. This crazy man just insulted a high-level federal official on live camera. Vanessa's face had gone totally pale. She wasn't thinking about viral content anymore. She was thinking deeply about federal evidence, about massive subpoenas, about the terrifying fact that her live stream had just beautifully documented a greedy billionaire committing absolute career suicide in real time, and her own name was permanently attached to every single frame. She quickly deleted the stream, but it was far too late. 17 different people had already screen recorded the entire thing. Within the hour, the damning clips would be everywhere. By evening, they would dominate the entire world. Julian sat frozen in his chair, just staring blankly at the signed document. His panicked lawyers flanked him on either side, aggressively whispering legal instructions he simply couldn't process. Simon Roth was already desperately drafting a public statement in his head. Something weak about terrible misunderstandings, something about missing context, something that would absolutely never be enough. The two military police officers suddenly stepped forward, not toward Julian, not yet. They positioned themselves securely by the exit door, a very quiet reminder that the room was officially no longer Julian's property. Colonel Thorne finally moved away from the large window. He walked slowly across the boardroom, right past Julian, right past the frantic lawyers, right past the crumpled page from Simone's notepad that still sat on the table like a tragic monument to pure arrogance. He stopped firmly in front of Simone. He didn't salute. He didn't speak a word. He simply nodded his head. The incredibly deep kind of nod that carries 30 years of dedicated service, 2 Purple Hearts, and the quiet, immense satisfaction of a good man who had tried to warn his foolish boss, and had then been proven absolutely right. Simone nodded respectfully right back. Then she carefully capped her pen, closed her folder, and turned to General Monroe. "I'll need a fully secure line back to the Pentagon," she said clearly. "We have a massive procurement review to file right away." "Yes, ma'am," the general replied instantly. They walked out together, Simone first, the towering general second, the military police third. The heavy door closed firmly behind them. Julian Sterling sat completely alone at the head of a huge mahogany table in a grand boardroom his grandfather had built, his father had successfully grown, and he had just foolishly lost forever. The expensive champagne in his corner office went completely flat before lunch. The viral video hit the internet hard before noon, not Vanessa Pierce's version. She had deleted that. But someone in the room, and absolutely no one ever confirmed exactly who, had screen recorded the entire live stream right before it vanished. Every terrible word, every cruel laugh, every snapped finger, and every single crumpled page. The first massive upload went viral immediately. The start caption read, "Spoiled billionaire tells Assistant Secretary of Defense to go get coffee. Just watch what happens next." It hit 4 million views in just 3 hours. By later that afternoon, it was on absolutely every major news network. One channel ran a dramatic split screen, Julian's arrogant, sneering face on the left, and Simone's official, dignified Pentagon portrait on the right. The lead anchor openly called it the absolute most spectacular display of corporate arrogance perfectly caught on camera this entire decade. Another network loudly led with the headline, "Go get coffee," inside the total boardroom humiliation that just ended a billion-dollar empire. One controversial network desperately tried to take a different angle. They briefly questioned whether the sudden contract termination was entirely politically motivated. That weak argument lasted for about 40 minutes, right until an investigative reporter pulled up Julian's actual Securities and Exchange Commission filings, and the segment quietly shifted to demanding total accountability in defense contracting. The hashtag started small. The hashtag #GoGetCoffee. It was trending massively within 90 minutes. By that evening, it had been enthusiastically joined by the hashtag Gray Sweater Energy and the hashtag Do Not Judge the Gray Sweater. A popular meme account quickly turned a clear image of Simone's calmly folded hands into the ultimate reaction image for unbothered power. A talented street artist quickly painted a massive, beautiful mural of a simple gray sweater with a large federal seal right where the heart would be. But the wild internet reaction was absolutely only the beginning. The Department of Defense Inspector General officially opened a formal, massive investigation into Sterling Dynamics later that exact same day. The scope was slightly narrow at first, just a routine compliance review directly triggered by Simone's on-site findings. They easily found completely falsified readiness ratings, heavily inflated unit costs, and wild delivery timelines that existed absolutely nowhere except in flashy presentation slides. Then, the auditors finally found the hidden subcontractor files. Sterling Dynamics had been secretly funneling 12% of its total defense revenue straight through a shady shell company legally registered in Delaware, the exact same state where Julian's grandfather had proudly built his very first factory. The illegal shell company, called Summit Peak Partners, had absolutely no real employees, no physical office, and no actual function beyond receiving massive wire transfers and quickly redistributing them directly to private accounts completely controlled by the Sterling Family Trust. 12% of $1 billion every single year for 6 straight years. The math was incredibly ugly. The actual intent was so much uglier. Senator Evelyn Harper, the tough chair of the powerful Senate Armed Services Committee, quickly announced a massive public hearing within 48 hours. She stood firmly at a wooden podium, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, and loudly said 5 terrifying words that made absolutely every defense contractor in America desperately reach for their expensive lawyers. "This isn't isolated," she declared. Julian Sterling finally received his official subpoena on a cold morning. A serious federal marshal personally delivered it right to the grand lobby of Sterling Dynamics, the exact same lobby with the massive 12-foot oil portrait of his grandfather, the exact same lobby where a smug receptionist had once pointed Simone Davenport directly toward the service elevator. The marshal firmly handed the thick envelope to Julian's nervous assistant. Julian wasn't even in the building. He was hiding out at his luxury penthouse on the Upper East Side, where he had been trapped since the terrible day of the boardroom incident. He was totally surrounded by lawyers who happily billed $800 an hour and repeatedly delivered absolutely nothing but slight variations of the exact same terrifying phrase. "Julian, this is extremely serious." The massive Senate hearing was proudly broadcast completely live. Julian sat at a very long table directly facing the angry committee. He was absolutely not wearing a charcoal suit this time. He wore a plain navy blue one. His highly paid lawyers had specifically told him that navy blue softly conveyed humility. His frantic public relations team had aggressively coached him on his posture. Lean forward slightly. Keep your hands highly visible. Make just enough eye contact with the senators, but not too much. Do not smirk. Whatever you do, absolutely do not smirk. He arrogantly smirked exactly once during Senator Harper's opening statement. A sharp photographer easily captured it. The damning image ran aggressively on the absolute front page of a major national newspaper the very next morning, under the massive headline, "Still Smirking." The tough committee played the viral video, all of it, on a massive screen that was 6 feet tall. Julian Sterling sat there and painfully watched himself repeatedly call a brilliant black woman the help. He watched himself violently snap his fingers at her, aggressively tear her important notepad, and cruelly tell her she was stinking up his boardroom. He watched himself arrogantly say, "I'll buy the Pentagon and fire everyone inside it, starting with the help." The massive room was totally silent. Over 200 people, completely silent. Julian's attorney, Simon Roth, desperately requested an emergency recess. It was instantly denied. Senator Harper leaned into her microphone and asked one direct question. "Mr. Sterling, did you know the true identity of the woman you arrogantly addressed as the help on the morning of the incident?" Julian leaned closer to the microphone. "I absolutely didn't," he lied. Colonel Marcus Thorne recently submitted a sworn federal statement indicating that he placed a highly classified briefing memo directly on your desk beforehand, a memo clearly identifying Simone Davenport by name, official title, and strict purpose of visit, the senator stated firmly. She paused. "Did you actually read that important memo?" Julian's lawyer whispered something frantically. Julian completely ignored him. "I simply don't recall," he answered defensively. "You don't recall?" Senator Harper removed her reading glasses slowly. "Mr. Sterling, that exact memo was successfully recovered from your office desk. It had a massive coffee stain perfectly ringed on it. Your own executive assistant confirmed that it was casually used as a cardboard coaster for your morning espresso." The packed gallery murmured loudly. One disappointed senator covered his mouth with his hand. Another shook his head very slowly, the exact way compassionate people shake their heads at a horrific car accident. The severe consequences came incredibly fast after that. Julian Sterling's high-level security clearance was completely revoked, permanently. There was absolutely no chance for an appeal. There was no internal review. The devastating letter arrived directly from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. It was exactly 3 paragraphs long, and it instantly ended his total access to absolutely every single classified program in the United States government. Sterling Dynamics was immediately suspended from all active federal contracts, entirely pending a full, deep forensic audit. Over 600 employees sadly received immediate furlough notices. The company's stock violently dropped 31% in a single brutal trading session. Vanessa Pierce was instantly terminated. Her professional online profile was frantically updated within mere hours, changing from Vice President of Communications at Sterling Dynamics to actively open to new opportunities. Those shiny new opportunities absolutely didn't come. Instead, Simone Davenport's legal team successfully filed a massive defamation suit, directly citing the viral livestream, the cruel captions, and the mocking emojis. The devastating suit specifically named Vanessa personally. 3 former Sterling employees bravely came forward within a week. 2 brilliant engineers and 1 dedicated project manager. They clearly described a horrible toxic pattern. Racial slurs used openly in important meetings. Deserved promotions unfairly denied without any valid explanation. A broken company culture that treated basic diversity reports as annoying paperwork and treated blatant discrimination as a proud tradition. Their sworn statements were officially entered straight into the permanent Senate record. The massive drone contract was officially reopened for aggressive competitive bidding. 14 different companies submitted strong proposals. The ultimate winner, officially announced just weeks later, was Griffin Holden Defense Systems. It was an amazing firm jointly founded by 2 brilliant veterans who had bravely served 3 difficult tours between them. Their detailed proposal scored the absolute highest in every single category that Julian's had miserably failed. The internet definitely noticed the change. The hashtag gray sweater energy evolved deeply into something so much larger. It quickly became a powerful cultural shorthand for quiet dignity under heavy fire, for massive competence constantly mistaken for total weakness, for the deep, quiet power of knowing exactly who you truly are, even when absolutely everyone in the room has arrogantly decided you're completely nobody. A young college student printed the inspiring phrase on a simple t-shirt. She amazingly sold over 14,000 units in a single week. Months later, Julian Sterling stood silently in a federal courtroom. He had absolutely no charcoal suit and no shiny fighter jet cufflinks. He wore a plain, incredibly cheap gray suit that his lawyers had carefully picked out. Gray because terrible irony has a brutal sense of humor, even when the cold justice system absolutely doesn't. The stern judge slowly read the final sentence: a mandatory 15-year ban from all federal contracting, $42 million in massive fines, 3 long years of strictly supervised probation, and 200 hours of mandatory community service at a local veterans employment center, forcing him to quietly help the exact kind of hard-working people he had arrogantly spent his entire pathetic career stepping over. Sterling Dynamics somehow survived, but only barely. The angry board fired Julian completely unanimously. They quickly brought in Clara Pendleton, a brilliant 39-year-old executive. She was the one single person in that terrible boardroom who had firmly refused to laugh. Her absolute first priority was total culture change. The massive 12-foot portrait of Harrison Sterling came straight down. In its prominent place, they hung a simple metal plaque. The plaque clearly read, "True integrity is never inherited. It's only earned." Griffin Holden Defense Systems proudly delivered their very first advanced drones right on schedule and entirely under budget. The 2 brilliant veteran founders warmly shook hands with their dedicated workers right on the factory floor. There was absolutely no flashy press release and no expensive champagne, just a great job done right. Vanessa Pierce quietly settled her massive defamation lawsuit totally out of court. It cost her a massive 6-figure sum and a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. She quickly moved far away to a quiet town, deleted absolutely every single social media account she had ever owned, and posted just one final, tragic sentence: "I really should have just put the phone down." Colonel Marcus Thorne finally retired in total peace. He did absolutely no press interviews, and he wrote absolutely no tell-all books. He just bought a quiet, beautiful house on the water, enjoyed a warm cup of coffee on his wooden dock every single morning, and completely embraced the well-earned silence of a good man who had desperately tried to warn everyone. Simone Davenport easily made the list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Her proud old Harvard professor beautifully wrote her glowing profile. He wrote that she absolutely didn't need a fancy title to command a room, and the truth was she never actually did. Simone didn't even read the article. She was far too busy. She had quietly flown all the way back to the south side of Chicago, directly back to the very public middle school where it all started. The exact same school where a quiet 12-year-old girl once stood nervously in a gifted classroom and deeply wondered why nobody ever believed she truly belonged there. She stood proudly in the large school gymnasium in front of 300 bright-eyed students. There was absolutely no wooden podium and absolutely no flashy presentation slides. She just wore a simple navy blazer with her proud Department of Defense pin resting quietly on the lapel. She lovingly told them the actual, real version of the story, not the viral hashtags and definitely not the internet memes. She told them the raw, honest version where she stood totally alone in a hostile room full of powerful people who had wrongly decided she was absolutely nothing, and she bravely stayed anyway. "They aggressively told me to go get coffee," she said warmly. "They told me I absolutely didn't belong. They violently tore up my notes, and they cruelly called me the help." She paused, letting the silence settle over the room. "And I stayed," she smiled. "Not because I had to desperately prove something to them, but simply because I had an important job to do. And absolutely no one, no fancy title, no towering glass building, and no famous last name ever gets to tell you that your hard work doesn't matter." A young girl sitting right in the third row slowly raised her small hand. She was exactly 12 years old, wearing neat braids and glasses that were just a little too big for her face. "Did you ever want to just quit?" the little girl asked softly. Simone smiled warmly, the absolute real, genuine kind of smile. Every single day, Simone answered honestly, "I just didn't." Later that evening, Simone Davenport sat quietly in her Pentagon office, the overhead lights turned low. A beautiful framed photograph of her hard-working mother, Cecilia, proudly wearing her white nurse's uniform, sat right on the corner of the heavy wooden desk. Right next to it, folded incredibly neatly, was a simple, plain gray sweater. She calmly picked up her heavy black pen, the one with the proud federal seal pressed right into the cap, and smoothly opened the very next file. There was always another contract to carefully review. This powerful story deeply matters because it forces us to look in the mirror. Life is absolutely full of difficult moments where people will completely underestimate you. There will always be people who wrongly judge you by the simple cover of your book without ever bothering to read a single one of your pages. They might look at your quiet demeanor, your simple clothes, or your humble beginnings and foolishly decide that you simply don't matter, but your true value is absolutely never determined by their total lack of vision. Real, lasting power absolutely doesn't need to shout. Real power doesn't ever need to cruelly belittle others just to feel incredibly tall. It simply sits quietly, knowing exactly what it's truly capable of. When you inevitably face blind arrogance, you don't need to match its toxic volume. You just need to stay totally focused, keep doing the hard work, and let your undeniable competence speak entirely for itself. And, just as importantly, we must always remember to treat absolutely everyone with genuine dignity. From the kind person simply holding the door for you, to the powerful person sitting securely at the head of the long table. Because true human character is revealed not by how we treat those who can clearly do something for us, but exactly by how we treat those who we falsely believe can do absolutely nothing at all. Stay kind, stay deeply focused, and never let anyone in this world tell you that you don't belong in the room.